中印关系。罗伊博士在相关期刊上发表了30多篇研究论文，撰写了大量书籍章节，并在萨西提学院的指导下撰写了一本翻译书籍。今天研讨会的主持人是前德里大学东亚研究系副教授马迪·坦皮博士。坦皮博士是中国研究所的荣誉研究员，曾任《中国报道》杂志主编。他的著作包括2005年出版的1800年至1949年的印度人在华 Indians in China 1800-1949 与 Brij Tankha 合著的印度、日本和中国的亚洲叙事 Narratives of Asia from India, Japan and China 2005年，以及与合著的中国与孟买的形成 China and the Making of Bombay 2009年，后者与 Shalini Saksena 合著。他还于2005年编辑了殖民战争中的印度和中国 India and China in the Colonial War。 坦皮博士还协调了一个项目，对现代中国历史档案材料进行编目。印度国家档案馆的中国在将发言权移交给主席之前，我想请所有参会者遵守一些规则。研讨会期间，所有参会者均需保持静音。您可以在聊天框中提问，并注明您的姓名和所属机构，或者您也可以在互动环节使用举手选项。之后，您将被要求取消静音。现在，我将发言权移交给主席。接下来由您主持，萨比博士。谢谢，谢谢，欢迎各位到场。下午好，我很高兴参加这次研讨会。我认识瑞迪很久了，听过他多次演讲。每次听完他的演讲后，我都感到他所呈现的内容让我深受启发。他是一位学者，一位非常严谨的学者，两种对一位优秀学者和历史学家至关重要的品质。其一，他对资料来源非常熟悉，对细节一丝不苟。其次，他喜欢突破学科的局限，提出极具探索性和趣味性的问题。我认为在今天的研讨会上，他将致力于此。他从摘要出发，试图引导我们这些印度中国研究界的学者走出舒适区，反思如何看待中国，如何看待印度。中国及其互动，所以我就不多说了。接下来就让第二爱来陈述他的观点，期待之后的精彩讨论。好的，DC 交给你了。你在吗？我向各位致以诚挚的下午好。锡金大学的全体同仁们，向大家致以最诚挚的问候。能够与大家分享这个屏幕，我深感荣幸。我和我的导师之一，本届会议的尊敬主席马德维教授在这里。女士们，我非常感谢阿尔卡查拉教授和 IC 兄弟会给我这个机会。我想分享一些我的想法。我觉得有些东西需要重新概念化，毕竟我们所有人都在学术界从事这个领域。尊敬的主席，如果您允许的话，我想分享我的演讲。看得见吗？演示文稿看得见吗？是的，女士，演示是可见的。是可见的吗？是的，是可见的。好的，好的，女士，承蒙您的允许，我想邀请大家参加这次研讨会。我今天的演讲主题是观看演示。在过去， 我们探索新的研究方法，并回顾历史，探讨中印双边关系。首先，我们将介绍研讨会的主题，然后简要介绍研究背景，并简要探讨研究目标，以识别现有学术研究的不足之处。最后，我们将总结我们的批判性观察和发现，并与大家分享一些思考。你呢？现在开始确定今天演讲的标题。如果你仔细看标题，你会发现其中只有几部分被标记为红色。现在这些是如果你仔细看标题，你会发现其中只有几部分被标记为红色。现在这些是这些批判性探究曾困扰我，让我困惑，也让我思考这些似乎有些令人费解的领域。现在我们开始研究时，要明白，或许透过过去的镜子或镜头来看待现在是可能的。
Scoring the fact that there is supposed there is a underscoring the fact that there is a fine line, a fine thread of continuity, and perhaps the present can be studied not in isolation, but rather as a continuum with its immediate and distant past. Now, coming to the second section of the title, it reads A Search for New Approaches, which means we are here trying to explore. The search is on, but we have not yet arrived at the results. And what are we searching for? We are searching for new perspectives, new insights, new ways of looking at the academic treatment of India-China bilateral relations, which in itself is multidimensional, multidirectional, multifaceted, and deeply complex. And we're attempting this through history, not just the narrow confines of history as an academic discipline, but all those interdisciplinary methods and approaches that go into enriching this discipline and taking us beyond its fixed parameters. Because I feel history has not been utilized optimally or to the extent it should have been when we come to treat India-China in its present state. Now, the talk shall be divided into 3 sections. In the first section, the study would review few critical observations and unconventional approaches made by experts, analysts from the field of international relations, history, religious studies, culture studies, and which have closely informed the critical inquiry here of this study. And in the second section, we would attempt to take a close look at the nature and the scope of India-China interactions. In the third and concluding section, we would once again revisit the existing approaches and see if there can be possibly some alternative lens to look into present-day India-China ties. Now, the background of the study, as we understand, is inspired by existing scholarship, much of which has been reflected and is being reflected through academic writings, public discourses, which mostly center around this Asian superpower narrative, where today India and China are being perceived as 2 very important emerging global political and economic players in the contemporary landscape of Asia and the world at large. And China watchers today are deeply engaged in meticulously mapping the nature of India-China future bilateral engagements, deliberating whether it would be one of contestation or cooperation or both. Now, given this backdrop, I would like to share with you a few observations of Professor Tan Sen Sen in his work, Methods in India-China Studies, where he cites the editors of the recent Routledge Handbook of China-India Relations, and they state that the relationship between China and India is widely regarded as one of the central pivots of world politics. While China-US relations will be determinative of global security, global governance, and even global prosperity, the interactions between the two Asian giants could well become the second most consequential bilateral relationship in international politics, at how these, India-China bilateral ties evolve over time. Now, the main proposition of the study here is, given this existing linear approach to view India-China relations only as giants, emerging giants, political players, economic players, perhaps this existing linear approach is a bit deficient. We need to look a little back into history and then try to understand how these evolved over time to become what they are today. Therefore, while acknowledging the need to delve deep into the study and understanding of India-China contemporary relations, I feel as a student of history, it's also necessary to sit back, revisit, reevaluate, and perhaps reconceptualize the research methods and tools, approaches and perspectives that have so far and are at present being employed in comprehending and predicting the nature of the extremely complex India-China relations. From here emerges the objective of the study here, that the seminar today seeks to interrogate the efficacy of the existing Westphalian theoretical model, which serves as the dominant frame for the study of international relations in general and interstate relations in particular, and to examine whether this is the only model appropriate enough to study India-China contemporary ties, and whether it does full justice, if at all, to the academic treatment of bilateral relations of non-Western polities like India and China, which have had deep, grounded historical connections. And finally, to seek and explore alternative research methods, tools, approaches, perspectives, if at all available, which would perhaps help better accommodate issues of concern that relate to the study of contemporary India-China relations. Now, before we proceed, we need to take a close look at the points of caution. Now, India and China are two of the oldest living civilizations, which are in continuity. And therefore, there is a strong thread of continuity for both of these between their present and their immediate past and distant past. That means when we are studying India-China relations in post-independence, post-liberation, we have to keep in mind that these don't emerge as newborn nation states out of vacuum, but rather they evolved. And they evolved from ancient geo-civilizational spaces into their present identities of geopolitical units. But they do carry a strong legacy of their own past and the past of connected histories. So these cannot be treated, therefore, as consolidated, unified, homogeneous spaces only. But we have to understand that India-China bilateral relations earns its complexity from the fact that these were not static entities. These have been dynamic in their evolution to themselves, to each other, and to the global context. So therefore, this fast-changing, ever-evolving two entities are being studied against each other, which possess very diverse, very different socio-cultural, political contexts for their own. So given this point, these few points of caution, we now come to the gaps that have existed, I feel, in academic scholarship, where serious academic attention has been paid to individual events, incidents, and issues related to politics, related to economy, whether it be standalone Indian economy, a study of Indian economic trends, political trends, Chinese economic trends, tendencies, their forms of connecting with each other. But these have been treated as individual standalone events, studied in isolation to their immediate backdrop. So therefore, there is a kind of a feeling that these have been treated as highly insulated, compartmentalized units, and have also been investigated through the limited, strict confines of a particular discipline. The approach we find is linear, while the patterns, the configurations, the tendencies which are ever evolving have rarely been mapped. And also the historical depth in analytical study as to understand the whys and wherefores of things that are happening in India, in China, and between them against the global context is somehow found to be deficient, sidestepped. Now, as I already mentioned, that this study, I'm not a student of international, very unconventional approaches and critical observations made by few experts from the field of international relations, culture studies, history, have drawn my attention and have been the inspirational force behind this paper, behind this study. One of them is Judith Ann Tickner, an Anglo-American feminist international relations theorist, who in one of her most representative works, You Just Don't Understand, Troubled Engagements Between Feminists and IR Theorists, in that particular work, she puts an urgent call for the need to understand that contemporary feminist perspectives are important approaches which are mostly sidelined, considered misfit within the conventional approach that we see in IR theorizing when it comes to dealing with the particular concept of security. And while talking about that at length, she draws our attention, which helps me as a student of history to understand how did this international relations as a discipline emerge, and what were the crucial points that have been highlighted. Now, prior to 1914, international relations, Tickner says, had largely been the concern of professional practitioners. But with World War I and the devastation caused by it, there was a need to look for new methods that would perhaps avert the inevitable international wars. And again, with World War II, she writes in 1939, the discipline of IR drew into its domain realist scholars and practitioners who supported the emergence of detached objective elites, as against the former uninformed citizens to conduct the study of international affairs. So there was a tendency to view the world as a domain of power politics, where states work towards their self-interest. Given this understanding, she further says that the Westphalian theoretical model has served as the dominant frame through which conventional discipline of IR perceives and predicts international affairs. And in this case, under this theoretical model and conceptual framework, conflict is regarded as inevitable in international affairs. That security is a concept which is central to the discipline of IR. That states fight over borders to ensure sovereignty. And the best way to prepare and ensure for the security of states is to prepare for war. And that there are ontologies and epistemologies that are different from those that inform the conventional approaches and methodologies employed in the discipline of IR, which are often considered misfit and therefore not paid attention to. And it is state-centric structural approaches which are employed for IR theorizing. Coming to the second research analyst, Professor L.H.M. Ling, she talks about in her book, The Tao of World Politics Towards Post-Westphalian worldist international relations, she comes to explain how the Westphalian world overlooks all other sources of power, focusing mostly upon that of the state and overlooking those that are non-state, transnational, and other social forces. And under the Westphalian system, she says we tend to lose sight of what otherwise the holistic human experience and insight could put forth. Therefore, it transforms it from a tragedy of power politics to a more global way of looking at interactions between socio-cultural spaces, rather than treating them only as insulated geopolitical spaces. Under the Westphalian model, L.H.M. Ling also points out that sovereign nation states are in a state of ceaseless strife and competition. And therefore, she calls for a post-Westphalian, if possible, and post-colonial approach to the study of non-Western politics. So from here, the first research question of the study emerges. That is then India-China contemporary ties and present-day engagement only about caution, conflict, mistrust, suspicion? Is it only about security concerns between our modern nation states, sovereignty issues? Is it only about competition or war preparedness? Now, leaving it there, we further come to the second line of unconventional approaches, again, one of them put forth by L.H.M. Ling, where she introduces the concept of worldism, which perceive contemporary geopolitical spaces as conglomeration of multiple worlds. That means not a homogeneous unit, but a conglomeration of multiple worlds with their unique identities, distinctive identities within a designated territory, bound within a complex matrix, which is in constant flux. Also, Professor Mahendra P. Lama, in one of his articles, Rethinking Security, Borders and Security, India-China, there he mentions that peripheries, borderlands are as important as the center, and perhaps their role in human interactions have so far been neglected in the study of the evolution of the state. So he brings out a very interesting observation where he says borders are not to be perceived as fixed, nor as rigid, nor as singular structures, but rather as flexible capillaries. Moving on to Professor Baladas Ghoshal in one of his keynote addresses, he mentions this new concept of introducing geo-civilizational approach as a tool of analysis for international relations, where he makes a clear distinction between the existing approaches of geostrategic and geoeconomic, and introduces that perhaps the geo-civilizational approach could be employed to the study of countries which have otherwise been culturally, geographically, and civilizationally close to each other. Prasenjit Dwara, in his work, The Art of Convergent Comparison, talks about this interesting concept of global circulatory processes, which have been deployed, controlled, regulated by societies, and not just through a top-down, singular, linear approach. That means societies have interacted in response and in reaction to global circulatory processes, and he introduces the dual frame of understanding particularity and generality. So he says generality refers to the circulatory processes that have so far been entangling the globe together into the modern era. And he says that these circulatory processes, the historical processes which are of circulatory nature, have neither been inspired with national goals, but they have much wider implications in society. Coming to our very known erudite scholar, Professor Tan Sen Sen, in two of his very important works, one is Methods in China-India Studies, the other Connected History, he challenges the conventional narrative surrounding India-China relations, which oftentimes emphasizes rivalry and isolation, competition and conflict. And he introduces this concept of connected history. That means India-China cannot be treated in isolation when we study them together. Pairing of India-China together can serve as an important method in China-India studies, he proposes. And he further says that India and China were connected to the larger histories and historical developments that were taking place not only in Asia, but the world at large. So he retraces the deep historical connections between two nations of India and China prior to their becoming nation states post-independence and post-liberation, and providing equal importance towards understanding how these ties were both complex and multidimensional. Further, he emphasizes the importance of understanding this interconnected history to grasp the contemporary dynamics between India and China amidst rising tensions. He also calls for rethinking, reconceptualizing a range of deeply ingrained disciplinary limitations, ranging from strains of Eurocentrism, regionalism of area studies, narrow confines of nation-centric paradigms, dominance of capitalist circulation, and invites us as scholars from academia to opt for a practice-oriented approach if possible, wherein knowledge produced from analysis of specific objects and phenomena can be productively delinked, he says, if only momentarily, from the particularities of specific examples to address a wide range of concerns. The second research question again emerges from here. Then is India-China contemporary ties in their present-day engagement also not about shared interest, shared civilizational ethos, mutual respect for each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity, mutual strategic trust, mutual sensitivity and genuine handholding? Now, as students of history, we do not have conclusive answers to any of these research questions. But what inspires us is to look beyond our limited, confined academic disciplines and search for methods and approaches which perhaps we could engage and form a broader framework of study and analysis. So the second section of the talk today begins where we ask the question, how far do we go back in history? And try to understand what is there and what is not there. Now, we are trying to capture the ancient and pre-modern period in the first few slides, which roughly spans over 2 millennia. So we need a kaleidoscopic lens and an encyclopedic frame to capture all of these events in totality. So here, I attempt to show and share a few glimpses of the diverse nature of India-China interactions. So our timeline begins from 100 BCE, before the Common Era, and extends up to the period of 1838 CE. But basically, we end the conversation for the pre-modern period till the 15th century. Now, when we are looking at the sources here, you see there are sources which are related to dynastic historical chronicles. We have Buddhist biographies. We have Buddhist canonical literature. We have Buddhist catalogs. Each of this initially inform us about mutual information gathering between India and China, as the case had been. Now, when we look at mutual information gathering, we have to be very clear about the fact that these were not building up of relationship right from the beginning, right from the start. But rather, there was this attempt to know about each other, not consciously, but unconsciously, rather a spontaneous attempt. So here we find that the excerpts here with fragmentary information about the geopolitical space south of Central Asia, especially in the Hindu Kush region, appears in Dhriti, Dynastic History, the scroll titled Sinan Yi Lietuan, scroll number 5. Then Hanshu, Hohanshu, Weishu, they inform us that there were tribal confederacies located in northeast of India and those in the southwest of China, which reportedly maintained communication across the bordering regions, predating the Common Era. Most of us are aware of the Chinese Han imperial commander and envoy Tang Qian. When he traveled to Bactria, he saw materials, fabrics being traded at the market of Tasya, which had been carried by Indian merchants via the northeastern and southwestern route. These were from the kingdom of Shu and from the kingdom of Qiong. And these were the ancient kingdoms in the present province of Sichuan being sold at the local markets. And the traders involved were Indian merchants from the northeast of India, traveling through southwest of China. And then along the Silk Road, they start selling the products there. Now, Han court's interest in the region around Chipin, which has been identified with Kashmir, some argue it to be close to Afghanistan. Their information about those regions, especially related to the flora, fauna, topography, social customs, were written down in Hanshu and Hohanshu as fragmentary excerpts. That there were constant communication between the tribes of the northern and northeastern part of India with the Man tribes of southwest China. Is the screen visible? Because here it seems it's frozen.
Screen is visible, but do you want to enlarge it?
I want to enlarge it, ma'am. Just a second. Is it better, ma'am? Is it better, ma'am?
Yeah, it's fine.
All right. Now, coming over to mutual information about China and India, we come to Indian sources, which Professor Chi Xian Lin has been working intensely upon. Ramayana, Mahabharata, Arthashastra, Milinda Panha, Lalita Vistara, all of these share information that Indians did know about China under the name China, Mahachina, and these were mentioned along with other ethnic communities like Kirata, Huna, Tukhara, Pundara, and Dravida, Cambodia, Yavana. Chinese silk was known by the term Chinam Suka, China Patta. We are aware of this, that the Chinese appellation of Sindhura, Chinso, was also mentioned in Arthashastra and Milinda Panha. We are aware that the Silk Road and the intermediary zones that were dotting the northern and the southern overland silk routes and the overseas silk routes were actually not just trading networks, but these served as networks for the dissemination of knowledge, culture, social beliefs, religious traditions, and one of it very strongly certainly was information about Buddhism, Buddhist teachings, Buddhist scriptures. It's interesting to know that the Central Asian Oasis kingdoms, located formerly in Chinese Turkestan around the Xinjiang province, kingdoms like Khotan, Karashahar, Tashkurgan, Nia, Lolan, these had very strong influences of Sanskrit language and Sanskrit Buddhist texts. So Fan Yu is what is mentioned in the travelogues of Chinese pilgrim monk scholars, Xuanzang, Faxian, I Ching. They mention that Fan Yu and Fan Shu were very much in use in these Central Asian Oasis kingdoms. Along with Buddhism were disseminated information, knowledge, stories. So Indian folklores, folk tales, mythological tales also traveled along these Silk Road. Silk Road was not a continuous pathway, but it was rather a crisscross network of several pathways and avenues. There was extensive trade in Buddhist relics, reliquaries, veneration items, mutual travel of monks from the Indian side to China, Chinese pilgrims visiting India, Central Asia, playing a very prominent role in bringing knowledge together. So today is just not a knowledge world. There existed a cosmopolitan knowledge world around the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries of the Common Era. If we take pride in saying that the world has come together, if we take pride in saying that we are more globalized and cosmopolitan now, then we have to wait and think and read through these writings where there is a sense of openness, receptivity, acceptance, the other's cultural elements, of the other's religious elements. These are a few photographs from the British Museum. Now, talking about India-China political and diplomatic interactions, this also happened. It was not just Buddhist connections or interconnectivity. We see around 428 CE, Chinese Emperor Wen of Song, Li Yilong, reign period between 424 and 453, is known to have received letters of credence from Chandrapriya, king of Kapilavastu. Now, the scale, the nature, the scope of interactions has not been elaborated upon. So as students of history, we really cannot rewrite the entire history. But what needs to draw our attention is the fact that rulers at individual levels, at the individual courts, were connected to each other. When we look at 502 CE, we have Chinese Emperor Wu of Liang reportedly receiving and sending an official letter to a certain Gupta king. The name is not mentioned. We look at Wei Shu, official dynastic history of the Wei dynasty, which says there were regular correspondence being held between southern dynasties of China and the kingdoms in southern India. And that during the northern Wei period, there were almost 27 times merchant travel between India and China. There were envoys traveling between these two ancient civilizational spaces. We are aware that Xuanzang, who is revered as one of the most erudite, distinguished scholar monks of China, having visited India, stayed back at Nalanda Mahavihara, studied there Indian grammar, logic, mathematics, Buddhism, especially the Yogacara school of philosophy. He was an equally important diplomat who played a very important role in bringing together political contact between King Harshavardhan of India, of Kannauj, and Emperor Taizong of China during the Tang dynasty. And there were almost 6 very important diplomatic missions and envoys exchanged during this period. Brahmana guests, they would call them Polwoman, they were escorted, brought to the royal court of China, escorted back with presents. There was exchange of technology in sugar making, Buddhist monks, missionaries being involved in the process. In the field of astronomy, astronomical studies, mathematics, astrology, there was exchange of ideas, as has been informed by Professor Chi Xian Lin extensively, where he says 28 nakshatras in Sanskrit were matched with 28 stars in the Chinese astronomical studies. The only difference was the order of the nakshatras in Sanskrit was different from the order as available in Chinese. In the field of medicine, we find there was collaboration. Yu Fa Kai, a follower of Buddhist master, did use Jivaka's ideas, concepts, to develop traditional Chinese medicinal practices by incorporating knowledge from Indian Ayurveda. Tao Hongqing was also one of those very reputed workers on medicine, scholars on medicine, who incorporated Indian theories in his work. Indian architectural influence was pronounced. All of this has been very beautifully compiled in the Encyclopedia of India-China Relations, the 2 volumes. As I said, this is an encyclopedic canvas. It cannot hold. But what we are trying to say is that right from the propagation, circulation of Indian Buddhist Mahayana texts, teachings, the concept of karma, retribution, purgatory influences, construction of monasteries, architecture, painting, mathematics, drama, the evolution of the concept of Tsumu alphabets in Chinese, because the Sanskrit sutras had to be actually read aloud. They had to be recited, they had to be chanted, and Chinese language was not apt to do that. So the evolution of Tsumu, ghost stories called Chirkwai, transformation text called Pianwen, everything was, so we can understand the level, the scope, the scale of interactions. There was no conflict, apparently. There was no worries about the other trying to dominate and perhaps overlook the right of sovereignty over a certain territory. Coming to 9th and 10th century, we see Buddhist-dominated ties have now transformed into trade and commercial ties. So Indian and Chinese rulers are now responding to the global trade network. So they are taking global economy to national, transnational, global economy, especially around the Indian Ocean region. From coastal ports of China to the ports of the Mediterranean Sea, Indian spices being traded, silk, Chinese silk being traded. There were reported exchanges between the Indian Chola kingdom and the Chinese kingdom. Chinese traders were warmly welcomed. There are excerpts, especially in Feishan's 15th century work, Xing Cha Sheng Lan, which says how the ruler of Bengal, the Muslim ruler of Bengal, welcomed the Chinese traders and endowed them with lavish gifts. So given this scale and scope, what are the takeaways, the critical observations? We are not focusing on individual events. We are trying to understand what was the nature of the interaction that we see here. There were involvement of non-state actors. So the question is, did India and China, were they in constant touch with each other? Yes. There was an evolution from the stage of mutual information gathering until they were well informed about each other. Then conscious, unconscious, spontaneous exchanges happened throughout the length and breadth of all possible avenues. But non-state actors were involved in promoting inter-civilizational contact. It was not the Chinese, because the concept of a consolidated geopolitical India and a consolidated homogeneous geopolitical China did not exist then. So the regional zones, sub-regional people, regional people, they participated either consciously or unconsciously, spontaneously or in a planned way. But there was people-to-people interactions. There was community-level communications. Peripheries were not just borderlands to be neglected, but these were actually the capillaries Professor Lama talks about. These were not rigid, but were flexible. The interlinkage that we see, the episodes of mutual borrowing, mutual sharing that we see was much more inclusive, involved in this exchange at their own level, at their own scale. So it seemed to be a universe in itself. Intermediary zones functioned as cultural interfaces. So there was no observable global intervention. They were interacting through a bottom-up approach, quite naturally, quite spontaneously. Now, moving on from here, if we leave it there and come to the second section, we here are talking about colonial and imperial period of interaction, a very crucial moment in the history of both India and China, when both were being dominated in different ways, in different forms, by the major colonial and imperial powers of the 19th and 20th century. So after almost a hiatus, after 13th, 14th, Professor Tansen Sen has contended that relation did not end until the 15th century. Trade was quite active, but it was no longer local and regional. It was throughout Asia. From there, after a hiatus of 500 years, again sources talk about. If sources are silent, it is very difficult to come to a conclusion whether there was something there overlooked or nothing was there. So sources say that once again, they were informed about each other. But this time it was not Buddhist India. It was not Heavenly Kingdom of India. It was an enslaved country. It was British India. And now when we look at China, it was the beginning of the century of national humiliation. So when we look at India, China in the modern period, by modern period, I begin from 1840 rather than 1912, because those years, those decades were equally important in the formation, in the conceptualization of what nationalism would be for modern India. So British India was one of the largest trading partner. And this period has been dealt with extensively by Professor Madhavi Thampi Madam in her writings and in the book that she has edited. Here we find episodes which have never been talked about, episodes which were never highlighted before, and they were brought to the fore. And here again we see the range of connectivities, but there are international players now. It's no longer India, China, Asia. There are colonial powers. There are imperial powers. So when we talk about trade, we talk about British India trading with China during the last quarter of the 19th century, opium, raw cotton being exported, China taking those imports. Then there is this shift from raw cotton to manufactured cotton yarns, how Indian firms are monopolizing their trade, how British East India Company and Indian merchants, Parsis, Jews, Baghdadi Jews, how they are drawing the profits. So here, the civilizational contact has been reduced and confined to the way colonial British India is interacting with China, a China which is also suffering from the suppression of colonial powers in a different way. We have seen chapters, sees Indian communities in China comprised of policemen, sepoys, mostly in the British security services, how the first Chinese settler, probably a sailor, had come into the Indian port of Calcutta during the time of Warren Hastings, how a community of Chinese then followed, comprising carpenters, shoemakers, tanners, and then at Ahiritola, Kasaitola, Baro Bazar, you see settlements of Chinese people, mostly fleeing the exploitation of imperialist powers, domestic feudal powers, and in the wake of the Taiping Rebellion around the 19th century. Now, there is a very interesting observation in one of the chapters of the book India, China, edited by Professor Thampi, where Robert Shaw mentions that in Xinjiang, there were seasonal traders, there were long-time settlers from Kashmir trading in tea, silk, wool, carpets, horses, mules from the Chinese side, but how the British efforts to establish a consulate there in Xinjiang broke the trust between the way Chinese would be treating these Indian traders earlier. So what we're trying to say is that the mutual trust is shaken by a third party. The mutual trust between the Indians and the Chinese is being shaken by a third party, the British presence in Xinjiang. The people of India are not trading in opium. The people of India are not smuggling opium. The Indian companies are now functioning as compradors, but the Indian people are not aware. of what is going on at a scale unprecedented. Similarly, when we see the involvement of Indian sepoys originally recruited in the British armed forces, in the British security forces, originally meant to fight the Chinese and the Britishers during the Opium War, during the Taiping Rebellion, we see how there is a divide. Those very recruits from the various Indian regiments, how they sympathize with the Chinese cause, and they step down from their services and they join hands with the Taiping rebels. Now, this cannot be seen as planned, as part of a larger conspiracy. This is the call of the heart. People of India understanding what the Chinese are going through and why at all are they not joining hands and making a call to uproot British imperialism and colonialism. We know about the intellectual engagements of intellectuals like Tagore, Liang Qichao, Su Tremo, although Kang Youwei, in his letter penned in Darjeeling around 1901, when he fled the 100 Days Reform, he did write to Liang Qichao that he had lost hope with India because India was no longer the Buddhist country they were looking up to. It had turned into an enslaved country. And yet, intellectuals of China, in their call for nationalism, were looking at India, but at an individual level. So Tagore's visit to China around 1924 did have mixed reactions, mixed responses. We look at Professor Tan Yun Shan and China Bhavan, my alma mater. So there, Professor Tan Yun Shan wanted to rebuild the long-lost ties of civilizational contact between India and China by bringing in Buddhist studies courses there. But actually, that was a very complicated frame. Tan Yun Shan, 1930, 1935, 1937, it's China under the nationalist Kuomintang government. And yet, we see there were leaders from India also interacting with leaders of the communist revolution. So you have Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi and the Chinese overseas community in South Africa fighting against the Transvaal Asiatic regulations, where they are sympathizing with each other, where Gandhi admires the strong sense of patriotism, sense of unity, sense of frugality in the Chinese people. We see Nehru and Chiang Kai-shek interacting with one another. We see Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose, although joining hands with the Japanese forces to fight over British imperialism in India, he also sympathizes with the cause of the Chinese. So these are intellectual engagements at individual levels, not nation to nation, not state to state. So what we observe here are discernible changes in the way India was looking at China and China was looking at India. So we had fresh perceptions. India no longer the Buddhist kingdom. India no longer the heavenly kingdom, an enslaved country. China no longer the celestial kingdom, but being broken into 8 pieces as a watermelon by the colonial forces. There was a new conscious group of Indian recruits within the British Army, Indian soldiers, sepoys, who were sympathetic towards the revolutionary cause of China. There were new sources of information developing, emerging about each other, new routes and modes of trading, of people, of commodities emerging. We see there was connect between intellectual thinkers. There was a common anti-colonial, anti-imperial voice. There was engagement of common masses, mostly from endangered Chinese laborer class, lowly class, not the elitists. There was people-to-people contact and a common call for nationalism. So now, given this backdrop, when we come back to understand where India-China relation at present times features, we see that there are a lot of problems left over from history. There are perceptions which each of us have inherited from our colonial past. There have been global forces and factors which have led to the reconfiguration of ties. And each of us have a renewed interest to showcase ourselves in international politics and economy. So now again, when we sit and revisit the Westphalian approach, we are all aware that post-independence, post-liberation, India and China relations was not all smooth sailing, was not all good going. We had the highest of highs and we had the lowest of low. Today, when we mark the 75th anniversary of India-China diplomatic ties, we know that we have had troubled times. When I initially started working on this paper 5 years ago, I was quite critical of the Westphalian approach. But over the last 1 year, when I have been studying deeply, I felt, does the Westphalian approach not really reflect how things are rather than how things should be? Probably the geocivilizational approach does give us alternative narratives that we can browse through. But at the same time, we cannot decimate the importance that, yes, there have been political tendencies of nation states which match what the Westphalian approach talks about. There is a state-centric approach which is explicitly visible in all decision-making policies of India and China. That as sovereign states, we are really concerned about security related to the border regions. That borders are no longer flexible the way we wanted to conceive or what they actually were. In the past, what they once were is not what they are today. Borders are rigid and frigid. We have to prepare for war because there were moments when we were called to do so. Therefore, when we talk about or think about people-to-people interactions, when we talk about involvement of non-state actors, all of this is no longer possible at a spontaneous level with a central governing structure or apparatus. Border regions, peripheral regions, or any regional, sub-regional zone cannot be let to do things on their own. So even if people-to-people interaction is encouraged, there will be state instruction. There will be state surveillance, which is required. Free flow of communication will not be as free flowing as it used to be in the historical times because the global scenario is fast evolving. It's fast changing. So where does this study take us to? As a student, it has perplexed me even more. The more I delve into the subject, the more perplexed I am. But there are a few takeaways from here. Because the Westphalian approach is not a failure, but perhaps it is not the only way or model of approaching the academic understanding of India and China in contemporary times. So what do we need to do? We can call for an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary, as many approaches as possible, where academicians from all fields would sit together to develop a holistic, comprehensive, nuanced understanding of the complex processes that have gone into making India and China what they are today, and responsible for their future engagements as well. We have to understand that the ever-evolving dynamic facets of the existing global order also deeply influences interstate ties. So perhaps too much of response or dominance of international political trends could be warranted against. At the same time, role of peripheries, intermediary zones, people-to-people interactions, cultural dimensions could all be included, but perhaps we need surveillance so that things don't escalate beyond and go to a point of no return. Finally, there is a lot of talk about the elephant and the dragon dancing together. It doesn't matter whether they dance solo, they dance together, but what matters is who is playing the tune, to whose tune are we dancing, and who is the maestro of that orchestra that is being played. With that note, and with limited understanding of whatever I've been able to gather out of all these years of study, I would like to hand over the mic to Honorable Chair, Madhavi Thampi Madam, and thank you so much all for your patient hearing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dhriti. you have really given us a panoramic survey. I mean, I really didn't think it would be possible in 40 minutes to present what you have done, showing the complexity, the many layers, and the continuity of India-China engagement. This is really, and you have presented it very lucidly and articulately. I took away three things from this, the survey part of your presentation, which is one is the importance of non-state actors, what today we call non-state actors, in the engagement between India and China over the centuries. The second is of borderlands, which as capillaries or as intermediate zones through which influences, knowledge, goods, and other things pass, as well as the importance of regional and sub-regional spaces in this, not to look at, this India and China as two centralized things. I mean, these are really important things to highlight. And, I think in the recent decades, we are becoming more sensitive to these. At the same time, the really important part, I think, of today's talk is that you've really thrown the gauntlet down to challenge all of us. And I would say particularly those specializing in IR, asking why, when this has been the history of the engagement between the two regions, why this is not taken into account when we discuss the future of India-China relations or even the present of India-China relations. Why is this seen as put in one box and doesn't seem to influence the way we look at India-China relations? So I really hope, since there are bound to be several people here who are specialists, IR specialists or practitioners, I would like to hear their response to you and the kind of questions you have raised. There is already, I would like to see a few more questions in the chat box, or if somebody wants to raise their hand, but there is already one question from Ambassador Rana. Ambassador Rana, would you like to speak directly? Or would you? I think it would be good if you could present your question directly here. Or shall I read it out? Yes, okay. Ambassador Rana, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Look, I really didn't want to be put on the spot, but I put a simple question to Professor Roy. Have you considered Kautyaya's writings on relations between states, kingdoms? Should not IR scholars keep that in view besides their study of Western thinking? I do honestly feel that we sometimes tend to overlook our own heritage. Thank you very much.
Dhriti, would you like to answer that?
Thank you so much, Ambassador Rana, sir, for drawing attention to that very important work. No, sir, I should admit I have not looked into Kautyaya's writings. And as you say, as you mentioned very rightly, this would showcase our perspective, India's perspective, and Indian policymaker and strategist perspective of looking at interstate relations. I will certainly go back and do a study of this, sir. Thank you so much for drawing my attention to this and the attention of other scholars also. Certainly, sir. Thank you so much.
I think there's a question from Rapai. Rapai, would you like to come pose your question?
Yeah, I think Dhriti can answer from my question what I written. If any supplement, I can add to that. Really, basically, I wanted to ask, you've done a very, well historical survey and the developments, but there are certainly many gaps. But I am looking at into the future, and a generation of students now interacted differently and who studied, especially the Indian students who studied in China, and including the medical field and others. How you are looking at the new generation? I'm not looking at any breakthroughs immediately because many of them may not be into the IR field. But certainly, I think Trump and his new world is providing us with a lot of possibilities. So the supply chains are changing, and the interactions, the business considerations are also changing faster than we think. So where you look at the historical background you've given, where you look at the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rappaisa. Thank you so much for that question. Sir, I'm very hopeful that if there is conversation between disciplines and also in academia and taking it beyond academia, as you mentioned, the business ties are changing, the nature of business engagement are changing. We are talking about the field of medicine, we are talking about the field of science and technology. If we can relax the periphery, the strict, stringent periphery that stops us from interacting, that prevents us from going into conversations with each other, if that wall could be broken, which I see is very much possible with the present generation. And also I feel I should not only include the present generation. I feel scholars of this and the previous generation are also very much willing to erase the fixed disciplinary borders, the disciplinary borders of academia, and be in conversation with each other. Because conversation would make us think. It is not about, as a student of history, I don't understand theories so well. I don't understand theories. But I try to understand patterns and configurations. I try to have these missing scattered dots, which if possible, if we could join them together, whether they would give rise to a certain pattern of our understanding. So, sir, as you mentioned, I'm very hopeful that if students traveling to China, if they are able to interact with students there, the way they look at not just our history, because history of ideas is what I would suggest we look at. So history of ideas not just pertaining to a particular discipline, history of ideas related to anything and everything under the sky. So if such conversation avenues are opened up, and if we can freely speak and exchange our ideas, perhaps there could be a way ahead to look at each other differently. Because honestly, as a student of history, I cannot challenge IR because I don't understand IR. So standing in one spectrum, I'm looking at the other and trying to understand. So imagine an astronaut standing on the moon and looking at the earth would be very different from the way a person who is looking at the earth standing on the earth. So I understand nothing of IR, but I'm trying to make sense. And in that, as I mentioned, and I honestly admitted that I am always left more perplexed than before. And there is no way forward. The only way forward, I feel, is more of interactions, conversations beyond disciplines, beyond academia, amongst all generations, not this generation, not that generation, amongst people. Perhaps that could be the answer, sir. I mean, that is my limited understanding of it. But this is how I look at it.
You raised a lot of points, and I agree with. But only I was mentioning that a tool which was not available to our generation. Because now you have internet, you have so many other avenues. WhatsApp gives an immense possibilities.
Right.
I think I was mentioning that as you and other people who are teaching now. I am not looking at the discipline has its own limitations. That apart, I think I am at least hopeful at one level.
Yes, sir.
Hope there will be better understanding or interaction. There will be nation state. There will be security barricades and barriers. They are not going to go immediately. But how the existing exchanges or the university system can, push up the interaction between the people. Thanks.
Thank you so much, sir. I totally agree with you, sir. I'm also hopeful. Sir.
Okay, we have a question from Ravi Narayan. Ravi, you want to come on yourself or? Ravi, are you there? Should I read out your question? Maybe I'll just read out his question and Dhriti, you can answer it. He says, he congratulates you for the presentation and says, yes, the Westphalia Treaty needs to be less highlighted. After all, in history, didn't extreme colonialism start after this treaty was signed by the warring pre-state monarchies? Okay, do you want to respond? Or Ravi, would you like to?
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Narayan. The point is, as I say, I see there is more of war now with very educated professionals at the helms of states. There is more misunderstanding. There is more intolerance, as you have pointed out. When theories were not there the way they are today, when concepts were not there, there was an uninterrupted flow probably between regional spaces. Not that it will always be the same, because states have evolved. The scenario has changed. It cannot be the same context against which we speak. But I agree with you, sir. I don't understand Westphalian system so much as you do as an IR expert. But what I understand is there is more of war than peace. With all international organizations in place, with everybody doing what is due to them, and yet there is so much of war. Yet there is so much of, least concern about genuine human issues. Why can't we rise above the immediate political trigger points? And why can't we look at humanity at large? I mean, is there something that would drive us in that direction? I don't know, because I don't have an answer to any of these, as I say. The more I study, I go back more perplexed. I keep the notes away. But there's something that again forces me to relook into those notes and try to look for avenues, because methods, concepts, frameworks, do they work at all? As much as conversations do. So, I also leave you with a question there. I mean, it is all for us to go back and rethink. And most of the times I don't talk sense. So it's utter confusion, and it's very, very complex and perplexing at times. So, but thank you so much for your comments there.
Dhriti, I have a question which is really more to do with your discussion of the ancient period, the attempts to understand and know each other. Would you feel that there was a similar attempt from the side of Indians, to understand China as there was the other way around. Because if you look at the sources which you have shown, overwhelmingly, we rely on the Chinese sources. And of course, you mentioned that there are, mentions of China or China in various forms, in various Indian works. But would you equate? I've always wondered about this myself. It seemed to me always that the interest to find out was more from their side than our side. But maybe I'm wrong. And I know you know the sources much better than I do on this.
Mom, I'm equally bad with Indian sources. I'm equally bad with Indian sources, as Ambassador Rana sir pointed out. Why not, as Indians, we look at our Indian sources, and Kautilya's work would be the point of departure for all of us. That is one. But I have not come across sources pertaining to the ancient period. But as a child, I remember we would have a lot of storybooks on the modern period, the colonial period. We came across fairy tale books and those folk tales where there would be a landlord, a story of a land. The Magic Brush, Ma Liang, was my first book I was introduced to during my birthday. We had a national book agency close to our place, and there would be lots of Russian folk tales and Chinese folk tales, and we would bring them. So that was when, through literature, we were introduced at a very young age to concepts, not concepts, but what the Chinese people were going through under colonial rule, under domestic feudalism, how the magic brush of Ma Liang helped him to win over these, the dual evils of imperial colonialism and then the domestic feudalism. So we never understood. We read them as storybooks. By the time we grew up and came to study, we understood that actually these were stories belonging to the modern period when China was struggling for its own identity, when it was trying to define its own identity, going beyond Confucianism. So I did not find sources in the Indian archives, but Professor Tansen Sen, I'm sure he will dig up something from somewhere. He will come up with sources, in a few of his recent scholarships, but I'm not aware of them because I felt the Indians have, even if they did know about each other, even if they did bother about what was going on in China, even during the ancient period, they did not meticulously record them. So without evidences, historians are storytellers, but storytellers who have evidences in their hands. So I don't think without evidences, we would be able to restructure or reframe the history of China in the eyes of the Indians. Apart from the pilgrims, the writings in the modern period, you had Indian travelers traveling who were writing about China in their memoirs, but those were all of the modern period. In ancient times, madam, I have not come across any such writings or any such sources that I can, discuss in my work.
Okay, thank you, Dhriti. Shreyansh, do we have more time? Are we near the end of our...
Ma'am, there's still a question from Dr. Usha Chandran. Would you like me to speak?
Yes. Is it there? Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, please read it out, Shreyansh.
Yes, ma'am.
There it is. Yeah, okay. Please read it out anyway.
Yes, ma'am. Firstly, she thanks Dhriti ma'am for the presentation. You have indeed given more voice and power to alternate methodologies. Do you think including non-state actors in playing a larger role in Indo-China relations would help avoid conflicts or deal with conflicts in a better way? Since currently conflicts have become the biggest obstacle for exchange among non-state actors.
Thank you very much, Professor Usha, madam, for the question. Even I don't have an answer to that because when we talk about non-state actors' engagement in present times, we cannot overlook the immediate the geopolitical international context against which this is possibly going to happen. Yes, involvement of non-state actors are important. These channels have to be opened. They have to be given a chance to play a larger role. But without surveillance of the state, without a conscious attempt, so when we are making, if you look at the difference, it is very much like two people are in a bad marriage and they are trying to make the marriage work. It is very different from, despite conflicts and confrontations in our older generations, people lived together. They did have periods of, the low periods, they had their highs and lows. But they did not consciously make anything work. So when here also you talk about non-state actors being involved, can they be given that free rein of doing it independently without a constant check and balance or without a constant surveillance? That is something which I am also concerned about. So here it seems we are trying to make things, it's all customized, and it's also, it's also planned, pre-planned. So we're saying, please, let us have community exchanges, let us have people-to-people interchange, let us have cultural exchanges. But that has already been scripted, which is different from the way things were when we did not have such a complex international context against which India and China were operating. They were dynamic, they were evolving, but the complex not so intense as it is today. So Dr. Chandran, I would also, I believe, yes, voices of the non-state actors are important, but will they be given a free rein to speak their minds, and would that be justifiable enough? Because if we do not define the territory, then it might spill over. And then we have to be ready for the consequences. So I, as a historian, I'm not supposed to predict the future. For me, as a student of history, I just look at the past. I dig deep, like an archaeologist would do, and look at fragmentary information here and there and join the dots, which sometimes makes sense because it's very difficult to make a prediction for the future. So Dr. Chandran, I indeed think, as you say, there has to be more voice, but it cannot be, without a check and a balance. That is my response to your question, ma'am.
No, I think that today, the last 20 years or so, not right now, today, at this, two of the real examples of, non-scripted people-to-people exchanges are, the flood of smaller Indian businessmen making their way to Chinese towns and, retail centers, buying goods, bringing them, doing business with China, and the flood of Indian students going to China. I've always wondered why this is not of more interest to our scholars who are specializing in modern or contemporary India-China relations. Because, literally we're talking here of thousands. We're not talking of just a handful or a few people. And, of course, we know that after COVID and, then the latest round of hostilities, there has been a problem with visas and going back and all that. But really, without, formal, calling this people-to-people exchanges and things, you have this kind of thing happening. People just getting on the plane, putting the money and going there and doing business, studying. And so I think these are things, that need to be looked at more, factored in more, to understand, the motivations, understand what kind of impact it, if at all it has, on Indians' perceptions of China and Chinese, which otherwise you don't come across. So anyway, this is just my feeling, something I've always wondered. Why there are a couple of notable exceptions. Ramaparu and Madhurima Nandi have studied students and studying. I mean, they have gone for medical in Kochi or places like that. But why isn't this coming in more? Yeah. Anyway, we have a couple of. Oh, okay. All right. Is there any final question or questions? One or two, if there are. Because I think Dhriti has opened up so many questions which have bearing on the way we study China and India-China interactions. If not, I think, we can, it's about time to end the thing. I would just like to thank you, Dhriti, because it's not often that we get a presentation where somebody is bold enough to pose these questions. And as you say, you don't have all the answers and you may be confused, like we are also confused about these things. But if these questions are not asked, and if time to time we are not forced to reflect on the way we look at China and we look at India-China, then I don't think we can really advance as a scholarly community here. So anyway, I would like to thank you.
My warmest thanks to you, ma'am. Despite all my, strange and stupid observations, ICS has always encouraged me to think differently. ICS has been a platform where, they say that, think different.
Yeah.
Even if it is, not perfect, even if it creates confusion, even if it leaves you more confused than ever, walk along a different path. So I'm so grateful to all of you, ma'am, at ICS. You have been my mentor, Professor Alka Acharya, everybody. So I'm so very thankful to the ICS fraternity here.
Thank you. And I hope there are many students here who would think through some of the issues that were raised here and incorporate that into their own research or into their own research questions. So anyway, with this, I would like to hand it back to Shreyansh. Okay.
Thank you so much, Chair. I seek your permission to formally bring an end to today's session.
Yes, please.
Yep. Thank you so much. With this, we come to an end of today's seminar. We thank Dr. Dhriti Roy and Dr. Madhavi Thampi for gracing today's seminar with their presence and giving us their precious time. We are equally grateful to all the participants for joining us today. We look forward to inviting you for our upcoming Wednesday seminar. Further information regarding the event can be found on